We have before us, regular listeners and whoever in the future, a man who felt the calling of justice.
Okay.
And tell us about your discovery.
Well, I don't know. Since I was about 7 years old, I wanted to be a rabbi. And what that's meant has changed for me many times since then. But certainly since Bar Mitzvah age, a big piece of that has been the ethical traditions of Judaism and of justice and justice for all human beings. And for many years I thought that I would live wherever in the world that I thought I could make the greatest contribution to that. In the early 80s, 81, 83, I worked for an organization called Interns for Peace, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, or at least not in the same way, I should say. We, at that time I lived in an Israeli Arab village in the Galilee, and it was at that time that I really began to understand first that I had a sense of community with people doing the similar kinds of work in Israel, and secondly, that of all the places in the world where I might try to contribute to Tikkun Olam, that my place, the place where I could make my most significant contribution, was there. And that was really when I said, this is my place. And from then until 1994 was kind of back and forth. Another big stage was meeting my wife, a third generation Israeli who, and also a rabbi, the first Israeli-born woman ever to become a rabbi. That was kind of icing on the cake. She would never live anywhere else. And we finally came back in 1994, and I began working for Rabbis For Human Rights in 1995.
Wow. You know, that hit me kind of strong.
Okay.
Rabbi, a third generation.
Yeah.
So that brings us to what I really wanted to talk a lot about is I haven't visited Israel.
Yeah.
And I wanted some general senses of Israel and what Israel stands for. I did have in the back of my mind a Torah challenge.
Yes.
That the language that Moses uses describing how to take possession, killing this tribe the men, this tribe the women and the men, and so forth. That language is difficult to defend in modern times, and I discovered, I claim, a piece in the Torah that I assume many rabbis have discovered before me. In Jacob's blessings at his deathbed, his curse on Levi and Simeon, where, to paraphrase his language, from your murderous ways my spirit is separate and apart. So the spirit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so it said, would not reside in the instruction to knock off the inhabitants. And as I read later, the tribe of Dan, for example, resisted the directions to knock off everybody and decided that people were innocent in nature and decided to coexist peacefully with them. And I think the end of the story is and they got wiped out.
Right.
But just that kind of language is haunting me as far as how it plays out that seems to be the authority of Zionism as far as treat the Arabs in a racial rationalization for not going to want.
Well, Dan was not wiped out, but we can be happy to say, but
that is good to hear.
When you look in the Bible, and certainly in the rest of the later rabbinic Jewish tradition, if anyone ever says to you, Judaism says, a big red warning light should go off flashing in your head, because our tradition is too ancient and multi-layered and complex and based on debate to say that about almost anything. And even in the Bible, we have the tradition of loving the stranger and seeking peace, and we have God's commands to, without pity, wipe out entire nations, men, women, and children. It's all there. And barring those moments in when God speaks us directly, and most of us don't have a direct telephone line to God these days. There's interaction between us and what we bring to the text, as well as what the text brings to us. And we have choices. We have choices to understand what. I mean, the Jewish tradition already said that the commands to wipe out nations were very specific for specific nations, for specific reasons, and things that they had done, and not to be applied to any other nations or anything else. I mean, they're problematic enough in and of themselves, but the Talmud already says don't apply that further. But nevertheless, each one of us makes choices in how we understand those traditions and what we do with them. The God that I feel in my life wants us to respect that image of God in every human being and seek peace. It doesn't mean that I'm a total pacifist. It doesn't mean that I don't recognize that there are times where one must defend oneself, and we can't ignore a reality that there are Palestinians that want to murder my children and want to push us into the sea. But we also have to remember the teaching in Pirkei Avot, the Rabbi Natan, who is truly mighty, the person that can turn an enemy into a friend. And so when faced with those choices and faced with the realities of needing to defend ourselves, we nevertheless have the question of how to defend ourselves, and as we learn in the Talmud and Sanhedrin, how to observe the command to use the minimum necessary force, even if force is necessary, and of course, if we're really on the ball and smart about it, maybe get out of the box and find ways that don't require force. In terms of Zionism, I used to not consider myself a Zionist simply because I thought to be a Zionist you had to believe that all Jews had to live in the land of Israel. I didn't believe that then, I don't believe that now. And then I read through a book, there's an anthology of Zionist thinking called The Zionist Idea, edited by Arthur Hertzberg. And when I read through that book, I saw there were all kinds of different kinds of Zionism. The common denominator between all of them being that Zionism is a liberation movement of the Jewish people, coming to solve and deal with saying that the solution to centuries and centuries of Jewish oppression is to return to our homeland. And so far so good. I agree with that. But then when you look at the different strands of Zionism, there are some that I find abhorrent and repugnant and racist, and others with which I deeply identify. And so it's not, you can't put all of Zionism in one bag or whatever. You have to ask the question, which strand of Zionism?
Now you are in Israel trying to deal with it, and there are people who take what they want from the words. And would you have a sense that the permission to engage in racist contempt for people that is going on in their brains, either literally or more commonly, it's like within the what I'm asking you along those lines is your own evaluation of the dimensions of that in Israeli culture. Is the younger generation break away from that? Is there a sense you have of changes among the generations, how some are more humane than others?
Well, I don't know how generational it is. I mean, in every generation, I think we've found people that have chosen the more humanistic strands and the more racist strands of Zionism. One of the challenges today is we have a generation that doesn't know about Israel before the occupation. They were born after 1967. It's the only reality they know, as opposed to an older generation or generations that know something else. But you know, every generation has its issues. Older generations for whom the Holocaust is a ever-present reality in their lives. Those who remember the what we call the War of Liberation, and there's called the disaster, the Nakba of '48, where an incredible percentage of the entire Israeli population died, and so on and so forth. Today, on the one hand, we live in a reality where, as I said, the young people don't even know what life was before occupation. And on the other hand, where if in those early years it was a question whether Israel would survive, especially given the attack on all fronts from the Arab world, today we live in a reality where we have the Arab Peace Initiative, and we have an Israel which, even as Ehud Barak once said, we are strong enough not to always be thinking of a mindset of we're about to be destroyed, and we should be confident enough, therefore, to make peace. So all those things are together, and so, as I said, in every generation, you have your racists and you have your humanists.
One thing I wanted to point out, to just magnify what you turned me on to, I hadn't thought about it, is that the traditional argument Holocaust of Zionism, that component of that faction or whatever, to put that in I think better perspective, your earlier point that Jews have been tormented throughout Europe for the last many hundred years, and that torment is an argument for the Jews to have a state, that there is this fundamental thing that is not resolved in our culture between Christians and Jews, and the Jews in Europe suffered the hostility of Christianity toward Jews, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious.
I think the greatest historical hostility was in the Christian world, although and things were the oppression was not as great in the Muslim world, although there was oppression there as well. I mean, Jews were definitely, as a whole, a second-class status in the Muslim world as well. But in general, not the same levels of pogroms and violence.
But so to always come back to the Holocaust as opposed to this position that the Jews deserve a homeland because as a dispersed people, they suffered dispersion.
Yes.
And I guess throughout Israel they talk about it plenty, but it just doesn't reach across into our media or our culture. So besides pogroms, I mean, the role of the Jew in the world, here we are.
Well, you know, it's interesting that, of course, that I won't say that it's an entirely positive thing to have this historical consciousness of oppression, because it can color your world in some very negative ways. We know from psychology that children who are beaten are the most likely people to beat their own children when they grow up, and you bear those scars. But it is a reality that imprinted in the hard drive of the Jewish collective consciousness are these centuries of oppression, and you're right, it's not just the Holocaust, but centuries of oppression and a historical memory, because people in this country, for example, look at the Jewish community, say, you know, it's a successful, affluent community as a whole. Why do Jews need a state? Why? Look how well Jews are doing in the United States. Why do they need their own state? I mean, isn't this working? And in the Jewish collective consciousness, Spain, Germany, England, all kinds of places that throughout history, Poland, where we were seemingly successful and integrated, and then things turned over and there was a disaster, and that was part of why in Jewish thinking and in the Jewish world we said simply integrating into other countries is not the solution. I mean, some people said yes. Not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Jews who are Zionists live in the state of Israel, and some Jews who live in the state of Israel are not Zionist. So it's more complicated than that. But one of the major conclusions by the late 19th century, as in the entire world the idea of a nation state was gaining hold, that the combination of the traditional Jewish yearning to return to our homeland and the fact that we were for 2,000 years praying 3 times a day traditionally to return to our homeland, and even from time to time in dribs and drabs coming back where possible, combined with the modern thinking about nation states, created political Zionism, and every attempt in the Zionist movement, for example, to think about alternatives other than the land of Israel, and there were other ideas that were mooted, just didn't work because the Jewish heart and soul was connected to the land of Israel.
What language can you point to that you've had among the pros and cons? How does the debate work itself out within the language of Israel culture?
Pros and cons about?
Basically racism, but racism in terms of possession and how to split up the land. Like, for example, the walls are presented to me as the form of Zionism that is off to grab the land and kick the Arabs out.
All right. Yes, there have always been some of the early Zionist socialist pioneers. You read their writings, and they talked about the Jewish and Arab proletariats joining together for a world revolution, and there were people who said we can and must live together. And there are people that talked even back in the 1920s. David Ben-Gurion from 1929 to 1936 was in favor of a binational state. And only after what some people call the riots and other people call the uprising of 36 did he say it's not going to work. And other people from the very get-go spoke about the need for separation, for expulsion. There were all kinds of ideas all the way through. And unfortunately, today's reality is one where those who have a more exclusionist understanding of Zionism seem to be gaining ascendancy. In terms of the separation barrier did not start out as a land grab, although it's become that. In other words, what few people realize is that to this day, the settlement movement is totally opposed to the separation barrier, because for them it's dividing the land of Israel, something which is an anathema to them. Ariel Sharon, our former prime minister, who is seen as the architect of the separation barrier, was totally opposed to it. He was forced to adopt the idea by grassroots pressure from average Israelis who were afraid of being blown up. And in fact, the idea really came from the center-left of the Israeli political spectrum, people like Chaim Ramon, kind of more Labor Party kinds of folks. When Ariel Sharon was forced by grassroots pressure to adopt the idea, he co-opted it and said, I will give you a barrier, but it's not the barrier that you thought you were going to get. All right, so if the people that had proposed the idea basically assumed that the barrier would be built along the 67 border, Ariel Sharon had a different idea. People say that Ariel Sharon changed drastically in his political ideas in the last few years of his life, and it's not really true. For many, many years, he had been saying that there should be a Palestinian entity on some 50% of the occupied territories. The only change in his last few years of active life was, instead of saying Palestinian entity, he started saying Palestinian state. But that was the only real change. And if you look at the original route that Ariel Sharon's government planned, and you combine it with a proposed additional route, I mean, the barrier right now is on the west side of the West Bank, but he also had an idea for another barrier on the eastern side of the West Bank that would separate between the Jewish settlements in the Jordan Valley and the more heavily Palestinian populated areas in the center of the West Bank. And if you look with those two barriers and you look at the map, what you have left in the middle is Ariel Sharon's 50%. That route that he planned, or his government planned, was twice as long as it would have been were to be put on the 67 border, meaning twice as expensive, twice as much time to build, twice as hard to defend, and ultimately, is what happened, 100 times more open to legal challenge, which is why the Israeli High Court struck down the original route and sent the army back to the drawing board. And that was in June of 2004. The army came with a new route in February of 2005, much improved, although still taking a lot of Palestinian land. And unfortunately, the High Court is not sufficiently stuck to its own principles, as far as I'm concerned. But in 2004, I'm not talking about the court in The Hague, I'm talking about the Israeli High Court. They ruled, yes, we have a right to build a barrier. Yes, we have a right to defend ourselves. But the barrier as it's now being planned, the route is unnecessarily and disproportionately violating Palestinian human rights and international law. That was the Israeli High Court.
When was the ruling?
That was June 2004.
What was the response?
Well, the army had to go back to the drawing board. That's Israeli democracy. And they forced the army to go back and plan a new route. As I said, the new route returned much more land on the Palestinian side and much less land on the Israeli side. But still, unfortunately, there is that swath of land between the 67 border and the route as it's now being planned and built, which creates a conflict between right and right. Our right to defend ourselves and the Palestinian rights to access to their lands, to their hospitals, to their schools, to whatever. And in fact, in the long run, I would like to see, I don't believe in good fences make good neighbors, and my idea of peace is not separating between people. But in the short run, I do believe that the barrier does save lives, although not as many lives as some people say it does, but it does have a security effect, and human life is an ultimate value. I would not be opposed to building a barrier on the 67 border for the short term. And it's amazing, many Palestinians say in theory they are against any barrier, period, but they say if you were to put it on the 67 border, we'd help you build it, okay? Because of course one of the issues today is Israel, in all its years of existence, has never decided where its borders are, and if there's going to be if there's going to be a one-state solution, then you don't need a border, I suppose, except for the greater land of Israel/Palestine. If you are trying to achieve a two-state solution, at some point you have to decide where the border is going to be. And many countries around the world have fences or something on their borders. There's nothing inherently illegitimate about that. Again, in the long run, that's not my idea of peace, but in the short run, if it saves lives, then so be it. Necessary evil.
Yeah, I feel you're pain a little, struggling to resolve the idea. I can hear inside how much the wall hurts you. That it is, walls are a hideous intrusion in history.
Right.
And I still come back to the nasty form of Zionism, what goes on in the mentality of each element of the increasing land grab of it all. Which brings me to another question. The settlement vector is, I assume, people who are deeply motivated by wanting Jews to claim all the land, and if they can do it peacefully, so much the better.
Okay, yes. Your hand gets into the camera a little bit there.
Thanks.
Okay. Listen. In terms of the Jewish tradition, the entire land of Israel, which geographically includes what's today Israel proper and the West Bank, is part of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. God promised that, as we see in the Bible, to the Jewish people. Therefore, many Jews, in their hearts, some for secular cultural reasons and some for religious reasons, would like to see a restoration of Jewish sovereignty on the entire biblical land of Israel. Some because it's God's promise, others because of this historical ties with the places where our prophets and our kings walked and this kind of thing. First of all, the difference between being a demagogue and a statesperson is the ability sometimes to separate between what you might want at some level and what works, especially when you take into account other factors like human rights, like the needs of other peoples. And so Ben-Gurion, again, for example, in his heart of hearts, he wanted the greater land of Israel, but he was a pragmatist. So he accepted the UN partition plan in '47 when the Arab world rejected it. He said, it's not what I wanted, but better to have something. And in '67, he was no longer prime minister at the time, he was one of the first voices to say, as seductive as it is, that we've now militarily reconquered the entire land of Israel, or most of it, he says, he was one of the people that said, give it back. Find a way of parlaying it into peace. And in '67, of course, there was a huge debate within Israeli society between those who said, strategic depth, this is the land of Israel, it's being returned to us, and those who said, use this as a bargaining chip for peace. And of course, there was the famous Khartoum statement of the Arab world saying the three no's. No recognition, no peace, and there was a third one I'm blanking on right now. But part of the tragedy is today we have the Arab Peace Initiative, which Israel's ignoring. And back in '67, one of the things that in the internal Israeli debate maybe tilted the balance towards the expansionists was that those loud no's coming from the Arab world. In any case, as I said, for many, many years, the majority of Israelis were motivated for holding on to the West Bank for military reasons, for security reasons, arguing that the strategic depth was necessary. You know, that 12-mile bottleneck that existed before 67 was where wasp place, where at one point the entire width of the state of Israel, with the West Bank cutting in, was only 12 miles or so. They said this is untenable. Today, you would find almost very few generals who would continue to argue that there is a military advantage to holding on the West Bank. If anything, certainly the settlements are seen by most military experts as a security liability and all the resources it takes to defend them and whatever. But into that breach has come this very seductive, powerful mixture of religion and nationalism. Before 67, one of the things that was unleashed in 67, you have to understand, my wife, for example, remembers huddling in a bomb shelter in 67 with her father off fighting, and but many Israelis were convinced this was the end. Israel was going to be wiped out. Now today, with revisionist historians, we may say, well, if you really look at which weapons everybody had, it wasn't such a threat that people were thinking, but that was what people believed. So when not only was Israel not wiped out, but there was this amazing, miraculous, quote-unquote, victory, many religious people in particular saw that as the hand of God. And if we say that the creation of the state of Israel is Reshit Tzmichat Gulatenu, the beginning of our redemption, this was another stage. And so you had these religious forces unleashed, which said we now must occupy and settle and redeem the entire land of Israel, and that it would be sinful, it would be a crime against God to have the land of Israel in our hands and to give it back, or not take control of all of it. And so that was, those powerful forces were unleashed in 1967. And so today, although they're really a minority of Israelis, the spearhead of the settlement movement are these people who are religiously motivated, or this fusion of religion and nationalism. Now, among settlers, some 40 to 60%, I would say, of the settlers are not ideologically motivated, but they are living mostly in bedroom communities just over the Green Line, over the 67 border, outside Jerusalem or Kfar Saba. And they didn't go there because of ideology, but they were lured by governments who wanted to, Israeli governments who wanted to build up the population in the West Bank, and lured them there with cheap mortgages and hopes and promises of a better quality of life, getting out of the cities and getting some fresh air and this kind of thing.
Like a home development hustle?
Something like that. And today you have many settlers who desperately want to leave, but they can't afford to, because no one's going to buy their homes, and they're just going to get so they can't afford to leave. And that's why there's been proposals by some progressive members of the Knesset and elsewhere to try to create a fund to help people sell their homes, to buy the homes off them, and help resettle them back in Israel proper. Okay, so that is 40 to 60% of the settlers.
Wow.
And then when you get into the heart of the West Bank, that's where you find your ideologically motivated, not all religious, but mostly religious, and many of them believing with God on their side. This is their sacred duty, by any means possible, to place all of the occupied territories into Jewish hands.
That reminds me of another point, that whether to place it on a religious basis that I understand, and I again don't know much about Israel, but my understanding is that there are an extraordinarily large number of Jews who claim to be atheists. And I would say that even among the atheists, there is still in their hearts a nationalism that is sort of the thing that is normal when you're raised in that situation.
Yes. Of the Israeli population, about 20% are not Jews at all. In other words, remember that within Israel proper, there are Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, and there is de facto discrimination, as in any democracy, but de jure they are equal citizens, and they're in the Knesset, and they're on the High Court, and they're vote and participate in all parts of life, with, as I said, all kinds of forms of the discrimination that take place. Of the 80% that are Jewish, again, probably about somewhere around 20% are religious, and 80% are somewhere on a spectrum between being, not defining themselves as religious, but having a great amount of sentiment for religion and being very traditional in many ways, to people who are virulently anti-religious, a whole spectrum. And as you suggest, many of those who are not necessarily religious still feel that cultural, spiritual connection with the land of Israel in a nationalist, cultural sense. Opinion polls show a consistent majority of both Israelis and Palestinians who are in favor of a compromise negotiated agreement. Unfortunately, there's a similar majority of Palestinians in favor of some level of violence, apparently believing that the only way to keep Israel interested in a peace process is the pressure of Zionists. I think that's a tragic mistake, of course. Among the Israelis, you also have some very serious contradictions. On the one hand, a majority will say we should be moving back to or close to the 67 borders. And on the other hand, they have a similar majority in favor of settlement blocks. In other words, this idea that you can give back most of the land, but keep certain settlements and redraw the borders and everything. Now those, anyone who looks at the realities on the ground say those two things seem to be contradictory. Maybe you could have land swaps, this kind of thing, but those are some of the inconsistencies. But they're in the realities of Israeli Jewish opinion. And the other thing, though, is many people say yes. In the long run, what we want is a two-state solution. Again, a clear majority of Israelis, as of American Jews for that matter. And yes, we want to go back more or less to 67 borders, but not now. Not while we're under fire, not because of this, not this, whatever. And this is what's really key. If in opinion polls taken before Anwar Sadat made his historic visit to Jerusalem, the vast majority of Israelis were rejecting the same agreements that they overwhelmingly approved afterwards. That act of Sadat visiting Jerusalem made it real for people. And part of the disconnect you see in polls is people saying, I don't believe it's possible. I don't have hope. I don't believe there's any, and you have with that majority of Israelis and Palestinians who want a compromise negotiated agreement, there's even a larger majority on both sides that say we want peace, they don't. And for all the ways that Israelis and Palestinians are not symmetrical when we Israelis have so much more power, we are incredibly symmetrical, in that we all so deeply feel ourselves to be the victims that we get outraged if you say that we're a victimizer, and we don't realize you can be a victim and a victimizer at the same time. And B, we are outraged, or we say there's nobody to talk to on the other side. We want peace, they don't. So that I think the key to any successful peace process is restoring hope that it is possible. That's what's so missing today more than anything else.
Well, now, which brings us to your work.
Yes.
So part of your work is educational, and I guess it's a kind of a public relations struggle in terms of which events to focus on to add your weight to. At the talk the other day, you were saying you've been quite successful with one lawyer. If you had 99 more, to talk about the...
If I just had 9 more, I'd be happy. But we in Rabbis For Human Rights are in principle always working on at least one issue dealing with the human rights of Jewish Israelis, at least one issue dealing with the human rights of non-Jews who are a part of our society or under our control. And we work sometimes with the courts, sometimes through public campaigns, sometimes grassroots work, sometimes working with the international community, sometimes lobbying the Knesset and the Israeli government, and when all else fails, sometimes through acts of civil disobedience. The 3 pillars of our work today are education about Judaism, human rights, and we work with the Army and youth taking a year off between high school and the Army, university students. We have human rights yeshivas at the universities. We have Talmudic-style commentary on Israel's Declaration of Independence, which we use as an educational tool, which has its vision of, that says that the country will be mushtet, will be based, the fountain of its inspiration will be Cherut, Tzedek, V'Shalom, L'or Chazonam, Shel Nevi Israel, will be freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. We believe that economic justice is a human right, and so we work on issues of poverty and unemployment inside Israel, which affect, of course, both Jewish and Palestinian Israelis. We work on healthcare issues, how the state budget affects the weakest and poorest Israelis. And of course, what we're most famous or infamous for is our work on behalf of Palestinian human rights. We also have started to work more and more with Sudanese refugees that have made it to Israel. Over the years, we've worked on many other issues as well. But in terms of the thread running through most of the work that we do in the occupied territories, I would say, is the fact that when the Oslo Accords were signed, a parallel process was created. Now, some people say that the Oslo process was a disaster from the get-go. Many Palestinians believe that it was a trap for them from the very beginning. If you could read Hebrew and you would visit Israel, you would see that many right-wing Israelis have bumper stickers saying, "Put the Oslo criminals on trial." As far as they're concerned, the Israelis who signed the Oslo Accords and gave the Palestinians the guns that they're now shooting at us should be put in jail. As far as I'm concerned, an agreement is a piece of paper. It's as good or bad as the people that are trying to implement it or keep it from being implemented. And so the fact is that it might have worked out, but what it didn't, and one of the reasons it didn't is because a parallel process was created whereby both Israelis and Palestinians, already back in 1993, were looking forward to final status negotiations. Now, we are a human rights organization. We are not a political organization. I mean, what we do is political, but we're not affiliated with a political party. We don't have a position on, there must be a peace process, but we don't have a position on where the border should be, whether there should be a 1 or a 2 or a 10-state solution or what have you. And people can negotiate as they see fit, whether Arik Ascherman likes it or not. But we do have a problem when you allow the ends to justify the means. Now, what was one of the basic fault lines between Israelis and Palestinians from the beginning of the Oslo process? From a Palestinian point of view, and we can agree or disagree, but we need to understand it, by signing the Oslo Accords, before the negotiations even actually began, and by recognizing the state of Israel, Palestinians gave up, from their point of view, their claims on what they saw and see as some 78% of historic Palestine. I mean, if we include Jordan as Palestine, the numbers change, but that's the way Palestinians see it. They therefore assumed that the end of the Oslo process was going to be that the remaining 22-24% was going to be a Palestinian state. Israelis saw that differently. They saw that all to be negotiated. So remember that the also process divided the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. A, total Palestinian control, B, Palestinian control with Israeli security control, and C, total Israeli control. If from the Israeli point of view, part of your goal was to, or is, to try to claim in negotiations as much of Area C as possible, you want to create facts on the ground, i.e. build and expand settlements, and keep the other side from doing so. All right? And
You know, while you're talking, hold the thought, but I think the rain stop, we can get a better background instead of the bars now that we have peace.
okay, all right. We only have a few more minutes and we can do this, but we can get
I'll just
at least.
move over a little bit. Okay,
All right.
Over here.
All right. Okay. Who is your audience, by the way, in this on this with the video streaming with your?
Well, we'll put it up on YouTube if you have permission. And I have a pretty good following, at least as measured by phone calls when there's a bad signal. The station says I get lots of phone calls when there's a problem.
Okay.
And they use that to keep track of what's popular.
All right.
But I offer a good product, so
Okay, I'm sure you do. All right, tell me when to start again.
we're going.
Okay, so given that,
You can see yourself here.
all right, given that, you want to create facts on the ground, i.e. build and expand settlements, and keep the other side from doing so. So when we deal with issues like home demolitions, for example, why this catch-22 policy where you manipulate building and zoning laws to make it almost impossible for Palestinians to build legally, and then when they build without permits, you demolish the homes? It's to prevent a Palestinian presence on areas that you're trying to claim for yourself. And again, these religiously motivated settlers that are so determined to, from a religious point of view, redeem the entire land of Israel, they have used over the years all kinds of legal tricks as well as force to take over Palestinian land. All right, so for example, in '67, when the Jordanians had, just before the war, had been in the process of registering private land. Many Palestinians resisted that because they didn't want to pay taxes. But then they really paid a price, because what Israel did was say that anything that's wasn't registered in '67 as private land is now state land. All right, and then you had a famous or infamous lawyer by the name of Plia Albeck, who in the 70s and 80s, used all kinds of formulas to expropriate and declare that land was actually state land or Jewishly owned land. And again, if you accept the Fourth Geneva Convention, one would say, well, state land must be held in trust or used for the benefit of the occupied people. But Israel has also said that the Fourth Geneva Convention does not apply in the occupied territories, arguing that because Jordan was not the legitimate sovereign in the West Bank before '67, because in fact they also had been ignoring the UN partition plan of '47, which that was supposed to be a Palestinian state from '47, they said therefore it doesn't apply. Most legal scholars in the world don't agree with that. So they've avoided that. And then, for example, one of the things that we've been dealing with in more recent years is there's a law called Chazakah, which basically says if you've been working a land for X number of years, 3 years or so, it becomes yours, even if it was technically owned by somebody else or state land or whatever. And in many cases, settlers have used their guns to prevent Palestinians from working their land, and then claiming it's theirs under these rules. So we do a couple things. First of all, we send our volunteers and ourselves as human shields to physically protect Palestinians so they can get into the areas where they're being repelled by force. And we've gone to the High Court. And in 2006, the Israeli High Court ruled that the army must do much more to protect Palestinians, to allow them to get to their land, and to prevent trees from being cut down in the middle of the night, and to bring the justice people to do these things. And so that today there are many Palestinians getting and working their lands that they weren't able to get to for 2, 5, 10, 15 years. In many cases, we don't have to protect them because it's the Israeli army and police that are doing it, believe it or not. We also have had some success with this whole thing of chazakah, because nevertheless, when the only claim that the settlers have is this claim of chazakah, and in many cases the Palestinians have documents to show that this was their land, we can get those things rolled back and overturned. And so we've been able to return thousands of dunams, there's about 4 dunam to an acre, to their rightful owners. But on the other hand, frankly, every week we're turning down cases because we have one lawyer and a few additional part-time people trying to hold the fort. Maybe one other Israeli organization that does some similar kinds of work. And I do believe that if I had a larger legal staff, a huge percentage of the land being taken over by the state or by settlers could be returned to their owners.
Well, you know, it's over after 10:10,
Yeah.
but this, in terms of getting more lawyers, let's
Yes.
address that. Like American lawyers, no. We talk about Israeli lawyers. Is that?
Unfortunately, you have to be a member of the Israeli bar, and secondly, you have to know the intricacies and sometimes the Kafkaesque intricacies of land law in the occupied territories. And even in Israel, there are all too few lawyers who really are sufficiently knowledgeable about that area, which is why even the option of getting more people to work for us pro bono or to volunteer some time just doesn't work. And what we really need is to increase our legal staff. One of the things I've done is propose to different communities around the United States that if a community could sponsor an RHR lawyer, it might be too expensive for any one individual, but nevertheless, lawyer salaries are less than they are here, and for somewhere between $40,000 to $50,000, depending on someone's seniority, maybe up to $60,000. Not only could we pay a lawyer's salary, but the court fees, their travel expense, all the things that would allow them to work, and that would translate directly into land returned to the Palestinian owners.
You know, in addition to you, I was thinking maybe you could talk it up at law schools in Israel.
We have, and we work with, we have like legal interns that come from certainly the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. There's a wonderful center there called the Minerva Center for Human Rights as part of the Israeli Hebrew University Law School. And yes, we certainly see one of our goals, whether or not they'll end up working for us or for somebody else, is inspiring young lawyers to think that this could be a career for them. Our chief lawyer, who is actually a Christian Israeli Arab by the name of Kamau Ishaki Aswad, when she came to us, she didn't know much about this field, and we trained her. And when she also had other opportunities, much more lucrative than what we as an NGO could offer her, she was sorely tempted. And one of the things that makes me so proud is that after some soul searching and realizing the good that we were doing and the importance of our work, she said, this is my place, even if I could make some more money somewhere else. And certainly I wish we could inspire more and more young lawyers to make similar choices.
Amen, brother. I'm over the limit, but is there anything, last words you want
Well,
to
yes, I would. I guess the last thing I would like to say, I want to go back to this issue of hope.
Okay.
You know, as I've said, our first mandate in Rabbis For Human Rights is to prevent or redress human rights abuses, whether they be perpetrated against Israeli Jews or Israeli Arabs or foreign workers or Sudanese refugees or any human being, because every human being is created in God's image. And our second mandate is to introduce into people's intellectual universe as rabbis that in a reality where most of the religious community in Israel is being socialized into a very nationalistic, particularistic understanding of Judaism, and most secular Jews also believe that is the true religion because that's what they see, and that's why as rabbis we teach, and we teach from the Jewish tradition, and we talk about Jewish values and Jewish sources and Jewish texts, but particularly in the work that we do in terms of Palestinian human rights, it gets back to this issue of hope that I mentioned earlier. And when you have a situation where most people want peace, and we really do, but don't believe that there's people on the other side that think the same way, what's your motivation to take risk for peace when you don't believe that there's anybody on the other side that thinks the same way? And sometimes, I don't know how many times when I've gone to rebuild a demolished Palestinian home, demolished not for security reasons, but because of this administrative catch-22 situation. And Palestinian parents insist on bringing their children out and meeting with us. And like deja vu, I've heard so many times the same conversation. My 10-year-old son has just seen his home demolished in front of his eyes. He's just seen his parents humiliated in front of his eyes. What do we say to our 10-year-old son when he says, I want to grow up and be a terrorist? We want our son to know that not every Israeli comes with guns to demolish our homes, that there are Israelis that come to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to rebuild our homes. Why is it that we get upset when we hear about propaganda being taught in Palestinian schools about Israelis? It's because we know that even if we sign the perfect peace treaty tomorrow, if we continue to teach hate about each other, that treaty is not going to last. And so, as far as I'm concerned, what we're doing is a just and right and Jewish thing to do, but it's also the self-interested thing to do. It's also the best way I can defend my children against the terrorists that want to come in and kill them. All right? And if we're really concerned about what's hate being taught by Palestinians about Israelis, what are we doing to empower that Palestinian parent that wants their child to know something else? And that's why I think that the real Zionism today is working for an Israel which is not only physically strong, but is morally strong. And for all the people that say we're anti-Israel or we're traitors or death threats or whatever the case is, the fact is the real Zionism today, as I said, is working for an Israel which is not only physically strong but morally strong, and that's ultimately our self-interest. I'll tell maybe just one more story. Okay, April 15th, 1994, tax day in America, and I'm at a protest against the route of the separation barrier, and at the end I get a phone call to come and because a 13-year-old boy has been caught by the border police, he's being beaten. And I and two other Israelis go over there. We're making our way to where the jeeps are. The border police shoot tear gas at us. The other two go back. I'm the only one stupid enough to keep on going forward. The commander, when I get there, beckons me forward, then grabs me by the throat, shoots me violently, headbutts me, starts screaming, "You're arrested, you understand, you're arrested."
What do you mean by headbutt?
He took his head, I think he actually had his helmet on, and headbutted me, okay? I see this young boy strapped to the windshield of
Sideways?
He's like sitting on the roof, on the hood of the Jeep, but he's tied to like a wire screen protecting the front windshield, and he's shivering in fear and unsuccessfully trying to hold back the tears. I'm handcuffed and put in front of a second Jeep. There's another man in the same position. The Palestinian youth who could have decided not to throw stones at their own started throwing stones, hitting the Jeeps that we're forced to be in front of. And for the next couple of hours, we're used as human shields.
Now, was your presence there? Did that stop some of the stones? I mean,
not that I could tell.
So they weren't trying to throw. They were trying to throw over your head, maybe? Or?
Well, they were hitting the Jeeps that we were right in front of. I don't know how much they were distinguishing. They were just. And as I said, we were being used as human shields by the border police.
Right. Now, while that was going on, what were the border police doing? Were
they were going back and forth and sometimes chasing after the kids, sometimes shooting tear gas, sometimes just holding their ground, moving around. And every time I would ask or demand from the border police to move us, not use as human shields, let me stand in front of the kid, to look after his medical welfare, to have him checked out, I was get laughed at or threatened. And so,
what kind of language do they use at you?
Oh, they were, I don't even remember all the language anymore, but it was, one time the commander just grabbed my shirt and is holding his head up to my face, and saying, I'm going to, bust up your face if you don't shut up, this kind of stuff. Now, on the one hand, I want to be clear about double standards. I was inundated with the press afterwards. These pictures appeared around the world. And at some point, even though we usually work with the press and we have no problem with that, I said to some of the reporters, you're obsessing on this. It's not like it only could have happened with the Israeli army. 2 weeks after this, the first revelations about Abu Ghraib came out. And there are so many places in the world where the things that I can do with the democratic freedoms that Israel allows me to do, in terms of using the press, the courts, and even with the greater, of course, limitations on Palestinians, which they can do, are still worlds away from a place in the world where having a conversation like this could be a reason to get shot. And there are places in the world we know that that's the situation. So I'm against double standards, people that holding Israel to a different standard than they would hold somebody else to, some other country to. But I also think about the psychological scars that young boy could have for the rest of his life. I know he was waking up with nightmares every night for at least a month. But when he gave an affidavit to our fellow human rights organization, B'Tselem, after describing all the horrific things that happened to him, he concluded by saying that a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue and told me not to be afraid. The work that we do is not fun. As an Israeli, as a rabbi, as a Jew, as a Zionist, there's no great pleasure in dealing with the deepest, darkest corners of the country that I love. But it's dangerous. I've been beaten up by Israeli security forces and by settlers, and I've had my car stoned by Palestinians. But I'll do it again and again and again for that young boy who will say, and then a tall Jewish man in a kippah came to my rescue and told me not to be afraid. Because there has to be a coalition of hope. Only I and my fellow Israelis, particularly religious Israelis, can break down the stereotypes and the hateful stereotypes that so many Palestinians have of Israelis, thereby empowering Palestinian peacemakers to be heard by their own people. And only Palestinians can empower me by breaking down some of the hateful stereotypes that Israelis have of Palestinians, thereby giving me a chance to be heard by my fellow Israelis. And so we have to work together. We're interdependent in this coalition of hope. In my opinion, it's the only way. I could hide my head in the sand about the things that are happening in the country I love and don't want to know about. I could say, I don't want anything to do with this country. It's a racist apartheid place and it doesn't represent me. Or I can take the pain that I'm feeling about things I would not want to believe possible in the country that I love to push me forward and push us forward to try to make things a little bit better, to try to forge that coalition of hope, to try to bring together the sane majority of Israelis and Palestinians who want a better future for ourselves and for our children, so that we will ultimately live together and not die together. And that's our hope, and that's what we try to achieve in Rabbis for Human Rights.